Matt Gaetz messed with her kids and she fought back. Let's meet Rebekah Jones. She's running against Matt Gaetz in his district, doing pretty well. She's a Florida scientist and COVID-19 whistleblower. Had a fight with Ron DeSantis too. We like people who fight back. So Rebekah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. All right, so let's take it one at a time. You're running against Matt Gaetz. What for the folks who didn't see us covering it earlier, we thought you did a fantastic job. But what did Matt Gaetz do where his team took a picture of your son, and how did you react?
He basically had someone follow my son at a public event and waited until I left to go to the bathroom for a few minutes and had photographs of him taken by himself, and then published those on Facebook and on Twitter on September 11th because he had nothing better to do that day, and mocked him for his low energy, knowing that he's autistic. And as you mentioned, I was not having that. I made sure that the public knew exactly what he did, that he's continuing his trend of stalking boys about my son's age. He's 12 years old. And despite thousands of outraged parents who have commented and told him that that's not right, he still has that post up to this day.
So you mentioned stalking kids. What do you mean by that?
Well, Matt Gaetz has a reputation and is actually under current active investigation for sex trafficking minors. And of course, there was the incident in which he falsely claimed that he adopted a teenage Latino boy who's a Cuban immigrant, even though his parents are alive and well off in Miami. So essentially, he just had a live-in underage boy live with him who started living with him about the same age that my son was.
That's a really weird story that we never got to the bottom of. So
no, it was very bizarre.
So the kid's name is Nestor. So Nestor's parents live in Miami and they're wealthy. So why doesn't he live with them? Why is he living with Matt Gaetz?
The question, isn't it?
All right, so I don't know, man. Matt Gaetz is a troubled fellow. So I saw some polls where you're doing pretty well against him. Now, that's supposed to be a very Republican district. So what's the state of the race?
We're less than 2 down right now. We have been polling ahead, but of course, this is an area that's very difficult. And Matt Gaetz is claiming vindication because of some positive PR, saying that he's not innocent, but he might not be charged because his victim might have a grudge, which is absolutely not true. He's very much still under active investigation, and the Department of Justice has publicly stated they won't announce their decision as to whether or not they're going to indict him until after the election. And it's close because partly this is a very conservative district. They don't like men who follow children, who stalk children, who bully 12-year-old boys for their disabilities online. They want people who are moral, family-driven people who fight for working class Americans, like most of this district is. And he is none of those things, but I am. And I have been embraced as a viable alternative, especially with the recent disrespect that Matt Gaetz has been exhibiting for our servicemen and women, and his comments about completely eliminating the VA, which a very large percent of our district here is dependent upon for the benefits that they earned by serving this country.
So Rebekah, I want to get back to your fight with DeSantis as well in a minute, but let's stay on your race. So tell me about your platform. So if you win, what would you push for?
So one of the things that's been problematic for Matt Gaetz in office is that he has essentially not been in his seat. We've lost 3 military missions in this area. In our economy, the biggest drivers of our economy are our healthcare and our military infrastructure, and then of course coastal tourism. And we've lost a lot of that infrastructure, and with it, a lot of the families that build lives here. So keeping that in place and not losing any more is a big priority. Making sure that we have somebody fighting for the infrastructure funding bill, for the VA omnibus funding bill, to bring those resources down to this area, because we are going to have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, at least for the next 2 years. And we need to have someone in place who can work on those basic maintenance issues like infrastructure that we have not had in this region for 6 years. And while there are existential problems facing our country right now, we are so behind on just upkeep that it would take me a whole term just to move through all of that. And some of my biggest plans are to create as much transparency, especially in campaign finance, as possible, because the system is absolutely corrupt, and Citizens United absolutely was a mistake, and we need to rectify that immediately.
So how do you see that corruption playing out in your own race? Because people talk about how Citizens United is wrong, but when I say, the corporate donations, for example, are bribes, the media flips out. No, those are our beloved corporations. How dare you? And our beloved politicians who are angels. So what's your experience in politics in regards to that?
I haven't taken a penny from any corporation or any super PACs. The only organization that I've taken any money from was the Teamsters, and that was the maximum individual limit because I do not have a PAC. I actually stand by my convictions and that super PACs are wrong and immoral and do not take their money. I've raised $750,000 and my average donation is $52. It's all grassroots fundraising because unlike some people, I live the morals and the principles that I say I agree with.
Rebekah,
but yes, it is very difficult to do it that way.
I thought I heard that Matt Gaetz does not take corporate PAC money. Is that true?
As his campaign company, no, but he does have a PAC. Oh, it's separate technically, and I do not.
Okay, interesting. All right. So now let's talk about DeSantis. So you accuse him of basically playing with the COVID numbers, doctoring the COVID numbers to make it seem like there was less deaths in Florida than there actually were. So what was your role at the time, and what did you think the government of Florida was doing?
So I was the manager of COVID-19 data and surveillance for the first 5.5 months of the COVID-19 pandemic in the state of Florida. I accidentally fell into that role because I was the only person there who had experience with disaster response, who had worked in crisis communication, who had a robust statistical background, worked in infectious disease, and knew how to build a website. And so I managed that project entirely on my own, almost for the entire duration that I was there. And when it came time to reopen the state, because despite what DeSantis says, he did shut it down for a month and a half. I was asked to develop the reopening metrics. And when I presented them, not to DeSantis, but to Department of Health bureaucrats, they disagreed with what that data said in juxtaposition to the plan that they already made before looking at the data, and tried to make the data match a plan that was an entire fabrication. It was not based on science or evidence. And in the following months, we had the first of 2 summer of deaths. And COVID cases and deaths were higher in Florida than any other state. And Florida also has the highest per capita deaths during the Delta wave as well, after vaccines were available. At the time, I didn't even know what involvement, if any higher ups, including DeSantis, had played in that. Maybe I was perhaps a little naive, but my whistleblower investigation ended 2 weeks ago, and the state sent me a letter determining that the state of Florida broke the law and asking me to do what they did. And in doing so, created a specific threat to public health, safety, and welfare. But since I was fired before I filed the complaint, it could not be considered retaliation to fire me. I was fired the day after I said I wanted to file a complaint.
Interesting. Okay, so the Inspector General in Florida did call you a whistleblower, but it seems like are you saying that they said it did happen? What you charged actually did happen? Because the press seemed to report it as that it didn't happen.
Yeah, that was kind of a big mistake. There was a separate investigation that I did not interview with that was looking at 3 specific individuals and whether or not they should be held culpable for things that were mentioned in my complaint, but it was not my complaint, and that was back in April. However, an Auditor General's report came out the month afterwards that found that the state undercounted COVID cases and deaths specifically in the thousands in the first 6 months of the pandemic alone. And the whistleblower case finished their investigation with the agency I filed it with Monday. I want to say it was 2 weeks ago, but honestly, as time goes by, it's been insane. It might have been 3 weeks ago. So Yeah, unfortunately, there are 3 reports now that all verify everything that happened, and some to a worse extent than honestly I had ever appreciated.
So Rebekah, let me try to understand it better. How did they undercount the deaths?
There were systemic errors in the data structure that didn't allow for reconciliation between databases, something that I complained about often. They were removing people if they believed that cardiac arrest at that time was not a symptom or cause of COVID, even though it is. So they kept changing the qualifications of what constituted a COVID death. At first, you had to be the first, cause of death had to be COVID-19, even though COVID-19 could cause respiratory failure or pneumonia, and then we bumped down to number 3. There was a lot of concern about whether or not the medical examiners were allowed to release that data themselves to the public. Some were threatened for suggesting that they do so. One was even fired. We had Department of Health employees who managed counties who were fired also for things as simple as encouraging vaccinations among their staff. And so this was something that was pervasive throughout the entire process. But of course, I can only speak for the time that I was there managing the data myself. And there were, unfortunately, a lot of different ways to manipulate data.
Yeah, and so last thing on that, you mentioned that Florida had more per capita deaths than almost anyone. So how much more people do you think died in Florida because DeSantis minimized COVID response?
I think that's an academic paper that we probably won't see for another year.
Okay.
And guessing blindly is not something that scientists like myself do, but the Auditor General found about 14% of deaths were not correctly reported or counted in the first 6 months. If you extrapolate that across the entire time period, assuming it didn't get worse, that's quite a few tens of thousands.
Yeah, okay, super fair answer. And finally, Rebekah, what's your website?
VoteJones2022.com. And like I said, we're less than 2 points away, and we are ready to finally rid this country of Matt Gaetz.
All right, we'll have the links down below on YouTube and Facebook. Rebekah Jones taking on Matt Gaetz, and earlier took on DeSantis on the COVID numbers. Thank you for joining us, we appreciate it. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.